about next. I wanted to get us talking and thinking about what Alan Liu calls the imperative of cultural criticism in DH. There's the tendency for us to think of DH basically in terms of tools and platforms and the technical details and the technologies, and you forget the centrality of the cultural record itself. My sense of the intervention of an African Digital Humanities in global DH is to think of how different aspects of Africa's past and current realities provide enough material for the kind of cultural criticism that Alan Liu says we must be alert to in the digital humanities. So my first major question, and there'll be a lot of questions from Brian, from Xavier, but I want us to just to introduce ourselves, to talk, if you want to, probably reflect on the current state of DH in Africa, and to think of the place of Africa in DH on the one hand, and then on the other hand, to also think of what an African digital humanities might look like from where you stand, from your own perspective. Anybody wants to say something could just jump in.
Hello, I'm Paul Olonuga. Well, I really don't think it can be perceived from one angle or one aspect, but I think what's really essential is to achieve a form of documentation of African realities. And this could come in different dimensions or perspectives. Of course, we all have different areas of interest. There are people who are interested in studying language and hegemonic narratives. There are people who are interested in the cultural aspects. There are people who are, like you said earlier, interested in gaming language and how gender and sexualities are documented. And so I think what is essential really is for all of these realities to be documented, and for people to have the platform to really present these things, and that for Africans and Africans in the diaspora to have a domain or to contribute to global discourse on digital humanities. I was sharing with a friend recently about the fact that if we don't key in early enough, we will probably be left behind, like it has happened in several other fields of human endeavor. And so I think it's just an opportunity for us to also contribute to the global discourse, to contribute to the narratives, and not be a late entrant into these discussions. Thank you.
That's an important point Paul makes in relation to the importance of documentation, and of course how that connects to open access and how democratized technological platforms help us to achieve that. I believe is some of the major issues we need to be talking about today. I don't know if anybody likes to speak to this. So what do you think an African digital humanities should look like? Should it replicate Euro-centric, establish Euro-centric patterns in current DH research, or could there be something alternative in terms of theoretical approaches?
I'm Dr. Okoy. I am very new to this field. As a matter of fact, I'm still learning, still trying to understand what digital humanities is and how it applies to my own study in conflict and peace and conflict studies. But from what James and the last speaker said, it seems there are concerns about agency. Even if we, as Africans, have to carve our space within the digital humanities platform, theoretically and conceptually, it raises questions about power. How do we carve our space in a way, like James said, does not mirror Euro-centric appearance of knowing? You know, how do we study digital humanities in a way that is African? And what does it mean to study digital humanities from an African perspective? So do we start constructing new philosophical patterns that reflect the African reality, informed by African ways of thinking, maybe using photos that originate from Africa, but at the same time constructing theoretical narratives around those photos that do not necessarily replicate Eurocentric ways of knowing. So I think it's the uniqueness and the agency that matter here, how to study digital humanities from an African perspective, ontologically and epistemologically. And we need to ask these broad questions. I mean, what is digital humanities from an African perspective? How do we study it? What is there about digital humanities that we need to really study from an African perspective? And how do we decolonize these dominant narratives about digital humanities in a way that does not undermine African agency? And how do we empower Africans to have a bigger voice, you know, in terms of knowledge creation? Because again, this is very complex, because I am coming from peace and conflict studies, and with my interdisciplinary background, maybe in global governance and all of that. So the way I look at digital humanities might be different. Maybe I'm looking at digital rebellion, how groups, you know, in the context of new wars, how the internet, for example, has transformed the nature of warfare to the extent that, you know, states are increasingly unable to manage rebellion, and how threats are emerging from online, trying to undermine the sovereignty of states. You know, this wasn't the same the case 50 years ago when there was no internet, where warfare is constructed, you know, across, you know, geographically defined territories. But now, insurgent groups have taken warfare to the digital space, and it's tough for states to fight these kinds of wars, which falls within what Ricardo refers to as new wars, even though some scholars have tried to define what digital rebellion actually means. So in looking at all of this from an African perspective, I think the best way I can study digital humanities in a way that reflects my research in Africa is to look at African realities, how African groups, insurgent groups in Africa are transforming the digital space, and as a result, undermining the legitimacy of the state. Yeah. So again, it calls to question, you know, agency, the agency of new insurgent groups, and how agency is no longer, the state is no longer, doesn't have the monopoly of power over its territory, because the internet has empowered other groups to increasingly undermine that territorial space and pose a new threat to the state. So this is how I tend to look at digital humanities. So like I said, I am learning. So I'm not an expert like you guys, but I'm still learning what all of this means and how I can apply it to my own field of expertise.
Thanks, Okoy. Before we go to the next section, which begins to narrow in on the place of praxis, the different practical and technical details to the topics we're considering today, I'll just like to listen to somebody else who might want to
thank you. Yeah, thank you,
talk
James.
about the, just
Yeah,
1 minute,
I was just,
please. 1
yes.
minute, sorry.
All right.
Somebody else might want to talk about the place of DH in African DH, but I really need to stress something. I do not necessarily believe that as African DH scholars, there's a need to reinvent the wheel. That's not the focus of all of this. And from Okoy's point earlier, I think the idea is to be alert to the particularities of local contexts and communities on the one hand, and now all of those could drive the kind of materials we are engaging with to a certain African agency, especially one that provides opportunities for some kind of decolonial approach to DH, as Ropika and others have argued. For those who are wondering, this introductory part is basically to offer some theoretical reflections and of course just to think of what an African DH looks like. I think we're going to Tunde Okwebi in Lagos, who has done a fantastic job in the last 2 to 3 years trying to build a coalition of scholars in DH, the first of its kind in sub-Saharan Africa, a kind of digital humanities symposium. So it's probably apposite to listen to you, and then Sylvia will take it off from there to get into the practicals.
Yeah, thank you very much, James, for your kind words, and then for your observation on what we've been able to do. Well, so far we've just been doing something very modest, if I can put it that way. We are still trying to learn the rope, and then of course try to steady the ship of DH in Africa from our own end here. I want to thank those who have already made some submissions, Paul, Dr. Koi, and James himself, on how do we define DH in Africa? How do we define African-based DH? Very important question that we keep on actually interrogating and exploring. But basically, I want to believe that one thing we need to keep in mind is that while we have local content, and then we are trying to actually rely on local resources, we need tools and technology developed in the West. We cannot run away from that reality, that fact. And so when we are trying to push this debate on decolonization, we must also keep in perspective the need to just build that coalition, that linkage, okay, like the one you are trying to do now. So I believe that we need to use the existing theoretical and technical resources to explore African big DH projects, okay? While we are trying to, we need to still rely on some of the resources, some of the technologies, you know, before we have the capacity to begin to build African-based technologies. We are hoping we'll be able to get to that as soon as possible, and then we're able to develop capacity. That's the kind of thing we are trying to do in Lagos by, putting this program together, the summer school, and trying to empower scholars, upcoming scholars, junior scholars in Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa. And we've been able to actually develop a few scholars who are doing very well in their various fields. But one thing I want to mention that is actually at the very center of my heart is digitization projects. That's an area I want to believe we can begin to focus on and DH scholars in Africa. How do we preserve our cultural and historical memories? Okay. How do we reconstruct the narratives about Africa? Okay. By trying to digitize some of these projects, some of these resources, some of these African narrative folklore, and then project them to the world. Because if we are not telling our own stories and we allow others to tell our stories for us, then we are going to lose the essence of the story. They will reconstruct that for us. So it's time we begin to digitize, we begin to let the world know what we have, and then we begin to reconstruct that narratives, and then, of course, begin to see how we can project that to the world. And we need the technologies that have been developed already to be able to do that. So that's my take, that while we are trying to develop our own local content, we still need to connect with scholars in the West that can actually, provide the platform and the technologies for us to be able to make our voice to be heard, and then to let them know what we are doing in this part of the world. Number two, it is very important that we also need to define what we mean by African scholars in DH or DH scholars in Africa. Okay, we need to define that very properly and put that in perspectives. Okay, there was a conference I attended just about, I think, 3 weeks ago. The same story, the same issue came up. How can we develop African theories to address some of these issues we are looking at? And so it's an ongoing debate that we need to begin to think about and see how we can develop theories, how we can develop, tools that we can localize, okay? What I call the contextualization and the conceptualization of some of these things. And so we need to begin to think very deeply. And I thank, the organizer of this forum, trying to bring us together and see how we can rub minds and see how we can come up with something that actually can benefit us as African scholars. For now, I will just stop at that. We can talk about other things later. One of the projects that we are looking at in Lagos is what I call, trying to look at the mention of Lagos City in literature from 1960 to date. Okay, we are trying to put together all the writings on Lagos and try to see how Lagos is mentioned and described in some of these literary works. And they want to just develop an online map that people from anywhere in the world can actually look at our website, go to the map and click on any particular personality or place in Lagos, and then they get details about this. It's something that I believe can be of benefit to the kind of projects we can begin to do in Africa that can actually redefine the kind of scholarship we are actually exploring in this part of the world. For now, thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm gonna take over. Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Silvia Fernandez. I'm the postdoctoral research fellow in Public and Digital Humanities at the University of Kansas. And I will be speaking about the differences, some of the challenges, and some of the possibilities in digital humanities. My specialization is particular US-Mexico, borderlands, and Latino digital humanities. So I'm gonna be speaking based on some projects like that can be considered in digital humanities for African studies. I'm gonna be sharing the PowerPoint and see. So there. Okay, so the first thing is that Moya Bailey, there's an interview where she defines digital humanities in a sense that she's speaking about to consider intersectionality within digital humanities. So that means is that it will be gender, that it will be class, but also the intersectionality of the people with whom you're working in your digital humanities projects. So I'm gonna just point out some part of this video, and after that, I will go ahead. Yeah, it is. Sorry, is that I want to put it on just the 6 minute. Yes, there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm missing out that one. Yeah.
Okay. So in that sense, we see that and it is important to consider digital humanities in a perspective that is intersectional. Within DH for Africanists across the globe, I think it's important to highlight that there is a difference between the global north and the global south that intervenes when creating or when we're planning to create digital humanities scholarship. And by instance, in the global north, there is also African American studies, which is really similar to what happens with the Latinos in the United States and the Latin American studies. So even though there are a lot of similarities, there's a lot of differences that are shown when you're creating a digital humanities project. Another of the the points is the diaspora, migration, and trade that can be more observed from the global north, and that can be a possibility of highlighting in digital humanities projects. African scholars in the US and Europe institutions can have a lot of privilege when working from the global north, as well as there are several archives that are held in the United States or in Europe, which influences when having access to these archives and creating digital exhibits, as well as who is producing this digital record. Is it produced from the US and Europe, or is it being produced from Africa? So those things are important to consider, particularly because of the privileges when working with technology and archives across the globe. Another aspect in regards to the global south, it is that there are some influences, and as you mentioned, how those digital humanities is going to be constructed or conceived from Africa, considering a lot of the colonialism and neocolonialism that is in this country, the dominant culture, and is it important to break that dominant culture and intervene in it, as well as to consider that the various communities, the diverse communities that even in the cultural record have been excluded or have been marginalized. Another aspect, particularly from the global south, is the local practices. So that means, for example, that there's a lot of projects that are not even considered within the digital humanities field. As for example, what James just mentioned about the group in in Facebook. There's a lot of groups in Facebook, a lot of exhibits in Instagram that are bringing a message, that are incorporating this to the digital record. But by instance, since there is no advanced technical skills, they are being even excluded. So it is important to look at those local practices that are forming the digital record within digital humanities and African studies. Another of the things to consider is the state of the archives and the accessibility in Africa. So is this archives, it's a priority for the nation? Are they taking the preservation for it to be then considered into a digital project? Is there accessible for everyone? Because those are, in a sense, some limitations in the future. And for lastly, the cultural record. What can be included and what can be maintained not in the public domain? Because sometimes when putting this into the digital domain, there is the risk that capitalism can take advantage of it, or that dominant cultures will then appropriate from these cultures. Moving on, there is some initiatives in digital humanities in order to think about the privileges, particularly within digital humanities. Where are the centers located? So in this sense, we can see that the United States, Europe has the mostly prominent DH centers, while in Latin America, in Asia, Africa, there is less. But we need to also think about that a lot of scholars or people, it's producing digital humanities personally without being attached to any DH center. Another initiative is around DH, which is putting several DH projects from around the world in order to understand digital humanities from a global perspective. And in this sense, we're seeing other platforms that scholars are using, and another way of defining digital humanities. And in this line, there is an initiative that it's Reviews for Digital Humanities. Is edited by
Hello, Alexis. We hope our Sunday video finds you safe and healthy. Since we're all in quarantine, we've been taking...
What is it? Oh.
Go on, Sylvia.
Okay, yeah. For the Reviews for Digital Humanities is a current initiative to also expand the notion of what is digital humanities. So in this journal, there is the potential of reviewing digital humanities projects and highlighting what these projects are contributing into the digital cultural record. And one of the objectives of this project is to highlight projects that are critical ethnic, African diaspora, indigenous, Latinx, Asian American, and post-colonial studies, in order to talk more about these projects rather than the domain projects that are mostly based on Western knowledge. So in this case, I want to discuss how we're moving towards a digital humanities that resist the reinscriptions of colonialism and neocolonialism. And some of the things that it is important to consider, it's the silences and gaps that are in archives. So how is it possible to visualize those silences that are important, those gaps that a lot of the archives have because of not preserving that material, or if there are just certain documents and there's others that are missing. How has the cultural record have been cataloged? Those that reinforces stereotypes, those that invisibilize a lot of the potential that archives have or history have. And in that sense, also, how can we, when creating a digital humanities project, we can incorporate the different languages rather than just creating a project in the dominant language? How is it possible to incorporate other languages, or how does the platforms work to understand other languages? How is it possible to put other stories into the digital record? So some of the possibilities is to build or to intervene in archives, to create new archives that are not in the institutions, to create new tools or to intervene in new tools. So in that sense, as James mentioned, digital humanities for ethnic studies, you don't have to invent the wheel. It's already there, and you can take advantages of a lot of these platforms to create your own DH projects. So in that sense, there are a lot of tools that don't consider some languages, but you can look for other ways in order to incorporate other languages and other stories. Databases are the same. There's a lot of databases that don't represent the cultures that we want to put into forefront, and it's our job to create the databases that we want, as well as other digital objects. In that case, there is the need to create other maps that visualize other stories, that visualize other regions. And that's more work, obviously, because it's the need of going into creating new archives, into creating databases, and then into figure it out how to visualize that through maps or to visualize other visualizations. But in that sense, it is a work into decolonizing, into deconstructing, and also inserting other voices. Another thing that it's important to consider is the new workflows, as Moya Bailey just mentioned. Digital humanity, the power of digital humanities is that the work, it can be in collaboration with various scholars across the world, as well as partnerships with institutions or partnerships with other communities, which is very important, because in that sense, you're not controlling the voices and you're not controlling just one narrative. It can be different voices, as well as to consider accessibility in the digital aspect, like who has access to the internet, who, as well as to be able to read the projects or to hear the projects. Those kind of things are necessary to consider. And in that sense, some projects that I will be sharing, and it's, for example, this project, it's Borderlands Archives Cartography. It is a project that it's mapping the newspapers that were produced in the US-Mexico borderlands from 1808 to 1930. And what happens here, that mostly the US-Mexico border had been always represented as a divided region, right? And through these archives, by instance, it was locating where are the newspapers from this region. We noticed that there are newspapers held in the US as well as in Mexico. There are some newspapers in Mexico, in the US, that are from Mexico, and vice versa. But it's also this idea of cataloging these newspapers from one nation or another nation, but it's not representing the trans-border relations or this region as united. So the project, what it did is to create the first thing was to create an archive that would put together this region from 1800, because in that moment, certain regions belonged to Mexico. And then as the years moved to 1848, there was a transition in the region. So the newspapers we took certain newspapers out of the data in order to visualize that movement in the map. But in this map, what it's creating a transborder archive. A transborder archive that doesn't exist in institutions, that in the map, it visualizes this region as divided. So in this case, this project is creating another object in order to visualize the communities that live in the border, that have been always connected and that are always in constant relation. Another project, and this comes to a lot of the violence or a lot of the exclusions that have been happening in the archives, is that a lot of collections, a lot of archives are not considered important to become digital humanities projects because there's a lot of documents missing, or the state of those documents is very bad. So for instance, the Delis Negron Digital Archive was a collection of a poet donated to the University of Houston. And the family found a lot of these documents in the garage of the house and started noticing that the Delis Negron was an editor for several newspapers, that he was very involved, he was an author, but so they wanted that other people could know about the history of this editor. And they donated this collection. It was a collection that, as you can see in the image, and if you go to the project, it's missing a lot of documents. The state of the papers, it's very delicate. But in that sense, when putting it in a digital platform, this platform is Wix. It's a commercial platform. But it was the intention of putting it on Wix. It was for others, to put the example for other Latino communities to create their own familiar digital archives. And by putting it online, there was a lot of the gaps were worked on, because the family intervened and started narrating a lot of the story that was missing through the archive. So those are some of the possibilities, particularly with archives that the state of it is not good, or it's missing a lot of the documents. But just by putting it online, it's also opening the doors for people to know about a lot of these daily persons in communities, and in this case is a person from the Latino community. Another project that is important is, for example, social justice digital activism. So TransformDH Humanities, it's a movement seeking to redefine capital letter digital humanities as a force for transformative scholarship by collecting, sharing, and highlighting projects that push at its boundary and work for social justice, accessibility, and inclusion. So this project also brings to the forefront a lot of digital humanities that it hasn't been considered, or it hasn't been valued, but at the same time it's impacting a lot of the communities, is representing from a social justice perspective. This can also be considered like analyzing a lot of the hashtags that are on Twitter that are part of social justice movements in feminism, in race studies. And in this case, moving towards the interpretation and representation in the archive, there is the work of several projects. In this case is the Early Caribbean Digital Archive, that it's putting together an archive of Caribbean studies. But what it is important is that in this case, a lot of the documents will represent this colonialism structure. And what they are doing in this project is that the pedagogy and the design of syllabus and activities are bringing other representations and are bringing other agency to Black people, to the slaves that are part of these documents, rather than reinforcing this idea of victims or of colonial perspective in the archives. And another thing that I mentioned is like how can you work with archives that are held in different institutions? So there is this example of La Gazette Royale project that puts together different newspapers from IT that were in different institutions in the United States and Europe. And the Haiti communities were not even able to access it. So by putting this project online, it is a possibility of putting this accessible to the communities where they belong to. And lastly, the main thing also to consider is that there are a lot of things that can be part of the public domain, but also others that need to be kept in the private domain. So by instance, this project, Torn Apart Separados, was a project that mapped the detention centers in the United States after the zero tolerance policy. And the main thing was to create a resource that could help the parents know where their kids, where they were holding their kids, the government was holding their kids. But one of the ethics was that it was very problematic if we will add the addresses in this map, because that will provide other problems such as going into the detention centers and do protest, or to also the trafficking of humans. So by instance, one of the works that was done was, instead of adding the addresses, it was just capture the image of where these detention centers located. And that was with the objective of bringing into conscious that probably next to you there could be a detention center, or that a commercial store was then converted into a detention center. From another side, there is information that needs to be out there, and the government or the public records are not putting it together. So volume 2 worked into showing what the money that was behind the detention center. And as you go to the project, volume 2, for example, that visualization of the map, it's a project that it's a visualization that shows who are the political representatives of each state, and how much money ICE is giving to that state to support this immigration system. So in that sense, this project shows the ethics of what should be included in a website, but also what needs to keep on the private sector. Finally, in my section, I think it's that digital humanities in relation working with the Global South material reinforces what Rupika Rizan mentioned as the opportunity to intervene in the digital cultural record, to tell new stories, shed light on counter histories, and create spaces for communities to produce and share their own knowledges, should they wish. And that's the great promise of digital humanities. So some of my questions and opening the conversation with all of you, it's that if you're able to share with us other challenges to create digital humanities scholarship that does not replicate literary, historical, and cultural canons. Another question is, what are other possibilities to create new competing, overlapping, and contestatory digital work that can intervene in the colonial dynamics and epistemic violence of the cultural and digital record? And lastly, what other aspects need to be taken in consideration when producing knowledge through race, gender, class, nation, geopolitical borders in digital humanities? And I open the conversation with all of you. So in that sense, like, what are the challenges, like, in your projects on and the ideas of working with digital humanities? What have been some of the challenges that represent, like, the inaccessibility of archives, a lot of the missing documents, or if you are, if you want to deconstruct a lot of objects, have you faced any challenges, particularly like in maps that a lot of addresses are not shown, or that the map doesn't represent what you really want to visualize? Those kind of things I would like to hear if you have faced those things or you have been thinking about it.
Is this for those who have ongoing projects already, or you're inviting comments from anyone? Sylvia?
Yeah.
Are you inviting comments from those who have existing projects, or you want anybody to chime in?
Yeah, if they have projects, or if they are thinking of projects, or that.
I know Hamma has an ongoing project. I don't know if she wants to speak to that.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ama Bima. I'm a grad student at Cornell University. I mainly study poetry and poetics, but I use digital humanities to help me think about global poetry, poetry from the global South, African poetry, Caribbean poetry, and so on and so forth. So I work on a project called the Global Poetics Project. In the link that was just shared, or the Google Doc that was just shared, I put the link in there. And for that project, the sort of genesis of it was simply that I began to realize, and earlier there was this conversation about what are the silences in the archives, what are the gaps in the archives. And I began to realize in my own research that when we talk about poetry or poetry studies, specifically as it's taught and researched in the US, it seemed to me at that time to be very Western focused. If we had African, Caribbean, even other racial and ethnic minorities, Asian, Middle Eastern, so on and so forth, it was very limited research, and there was very limited cataloging of it online specifically. So what I sought to do was to try and figure out a way to map out global poetry, to try and figure out who are the, you know, the living poets right now in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Barbados, like who are the poets on the ground right now. And I think your question, Sylvia, was about the sort of difficulties we've encountered with that. And so here are a few of the difficulties I've had. One of the first things I sought out to do was to do some scraping of current websites that talk about global poetry. So I used Scrapey and Python to do that. And what I found when going to like the major poetry websites, like the Poetry Foundation, less than like 3% of the poetry on there was of Africans, less than 2% was of Africans, and less than like 3 to 4% were of racial and ethnic minorities at all. So that was the first thing I realized, is that if my research was going to be honing in on websites and trying to organize based on that, it wouldn't work because the data wasn't there. There were silences in those archives already. So what I started to do is I tried to do some crowdsourcing. I sent out a lot of emails to people saying, hey, if you know of poets, you know, ask them to fill out this form, which, you know, is an address, coordinates, information, so I can upload it into a map. But one of the things, I mean, that's easy to do when you're only working with a small data set. Right now I have a raw data set of about 3,000, and that's hard to do by hand. And the issue that I'm having right now is that tools that would take addresses or that would take locations like a city in a country and would turn that into longitude and latitude so that I could map it out, they don't map out African countries and African nations, right? So that was the big issue, is that the tools weren't available to me. The second thing was that it's really difficult, or at least it was really difficult for me to find a way to track movements, because I'm working on global poetry. I'm interested in the movements of poets across the world through various diasporas, from the south to the north, from the east to the west, whatever it may be. I'm interested in mapping that out. So it was easy to map out where they were coming when they went to like London, when they went to like Frankfurt, when they went to New York City. But it was hard to point out their starting points, which might be, for some of the poets I was working with, Kumasi, Ghana, Lagos, places in Tanzania. Those were difficult to get coordinates for through like the sort of tools that are available to us right now. So that's where I'm at right now. Yeah, so those are some of the difficulties, but I'm still trying to figure out who the poets are, who I want to add to the archive, and I'm trying to make it as robust and as inclusive as possible, while also still realizing that not all of the poets I want to work with are available online already, even through things like Twitter or Facebook, for me to even reach out to them. So that's where the project is right now. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, what you just mentioned, it's a great example of some of the, I think its challenges is like, and it requires more work because a lot of this work hasn't been done. And we can see that, like, for example, what you just mentioned, there is a lot of platforms that work with maps, but it's just always reinforcing certain regions. In the project of Borderlands Archives Cartography, there is the addresses used to be when the newspaper belonged to Mexico, so now the address changed. So you can find that. You can find the address that was mentioned in the newspaper. Or as gentrification is changing everything, now that address disappear. So those kind of things are like, I think it's also documenting a lot of what not even this GIS platforms are considering.
I just wanted to add in one more thing. As I was scraping websites, one of the things that was particularly interesting was that in their metadata, when they would list out nation or country or nationality, for American poets, they would, in the metadata, it would actually tell you the regions of the US. Then the metadata for African poets, it was African, right? It wasn't even West or South or East, it was just African, which meant that when I was trying to go through that data again, I then had to go and do my own research to try and and put them into a correct region because it wasn't in the data already. Same thing with Caribbean poets, same thing with Asian poets as well. So it seems to me that, again, going back to this question of silences in the archive, that even when we have that 2% or 4% representation in the archives that exist right now, it's labeled incorrectly. And then we have to go back and do that work of rectifying the issues that are in the archives right now.
Yes, totally. And it's like, it's creating other categories that were not considered, or a lot of these labels that are really general. Like there's a project, the Torn Apart Separados project, where we were tracing the money that was behind the detention centers, mostly when like the companies that support ICE were just labeled as, this is owned by a Hispanic woman, and that's it. Or this company, it's owned by a Black man. And that doesn't tell us that's very general, that when we were gonna visualize that kind of information, it was also problematic. So we were rethinking about how to show that, but at the same time not reinforcing these generalizations of, oh, it's owned by a Hispanic woman. Yeah, but a Hispanic woman from where, or those kind of things that still invisibilize a lot of what is intention to represent. Any other challenges that anyone would like to share, thinking about their own projects or the ideas of what you're thinking on working?
Yeah, if I may come in. Yeah. My own challenge really is about the fact that in many Nigerian, humanities background, for most of us, we have a challenge with things with statistics, like statistical packages, and sometimes software for analysis. Currently, I'm working on a project on the politics of representations of homosexuality in Nigerian Twitter. Prior to these, I've been very used to textual analysis, but because I'm employing something on corpus linguistics, I'm working on thousands of word lists, which are tweet extracts. But the main challenge for me really has been the fact that I'm getting exposed to a number of statistical analytical packages that I haven't been using before now. For instance, I got a Python-based analytical package, and for the life of me, I haven't used that before. So there are some that are a little easier to use. For instance, the ANSCONC, where for linguistic-based researches, that's easy for me to maneuver. But for some more maybe graphic or some more statistics-oriented analysis, it becomes a little difficult to navigate. And so it could be because of curriculum background. We had, the infrastructure, the software haven't been things that we are used to in many Nigerian universities. And that's where I have to commend Professor Opaibi for his huge work on digital humanities in Nigeria. West Africa is really opening our eyes to things. But I think that's primarily the challenge most of researchers from Africa or West Africa or Nigeria that I'm more familiar with face. So right now I'm trying to embrace these packages, but sometimes it's not that easy because it's something new. It's something one has to learn. But if most of the people around you aren't also familiar with it, then it becomes a serious challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's like one of the things to consider is also like, I think one of the powers of digital humanities is like collaboration. So in that sense, it's like thinking about working with other people that can be more familiar with the platforms in order to really advance in some of the limitations.
Yeah. Sylvia, I wonder if some of these questions could also be repeated. We could come back to some of these issues after Brian's session,
Yes.
and hopefully we'll have a lot of time to really talk. But what Paul raises is important, right? They need to learn new tools and acquire new forms of knowledge. And I think I'm amid. Brian, can you hear me? Okay, great. Just one minute, please.
Okay.
Amma made a very important point earlier, and that's the epistemic violences of existing tools. I think that's something that is important to stress, especially for those of us working out of Lagos, out of Accra, or probably Cape Town. And this is particularly important if you think about some other kinds of existing resources out there. And I'm talking about human resources. Out of Lagos, for instance, you have a thriving technological industry around the Yaba area. You have people you can collaborate with to create the kind of tools that give you that help you create the kind of alternative knowledges you want to create. So we can talk about these kind of things and how we can collaborate probably by the last session, or we should take this to another level and invite Brian to wrap up the session.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you all for joining us. And thanks, James, for organizing this and for inviting me to be a part of it. I really think it's a really great conversation. My name is Brian Rosenblum. I am the co-director of our Digital Humanities Center here at University of Kansas. I'm not an Africanist, so I hope that I just plan to share my perspective here as a librarian with a background in scholarly publishing and working with faculty on a number of digital projects. And I hope that will be of some use and can add to the conversation. Give me a minute and let me share my screen here. All right. Okay. So I've titled my section Nuts and Bolts, Planning and Sustaining a Digital Humanities Project. And I'm going to talk not so much about specific platforms or tools because they're so dependent on specific projects and resources available, but hopefully just some general concepts and frameworks that can help people move forward with digital projects. So one thing that I'd like to stress, and we've heard this already in different forms, is that digital projects are not just technical initiatives, but they're also social initiatives. So in addition to the content and the technical infrastructure, they are a set of services and resources, often done collaboratively, that are developed and actively maintained by an engaged community. The role of institutional support can be really crucial here. We've seen, especially in the early days of the internet, but also today, digital humanities projects that are really vulnerable, that are those that are done outside of institutional structures. So often one-off individual projects that scholars put up on personal servers or web space will often disappear. You'll see broken links. They don't have necessarily an archiving plan. So I find that digital humanities is interesting because it can reveal often the limits of our academic structures in terms of how we get academic credit, what kind of labor is needed. But at the same time, as Sylvia mentioned in her last slide, this is the digital humanities provides this opportunity for scholars, librarians, museums, students, technologists to work together and recapture, preserve, make available the cultural record. So one framework that can be helpful that I'd like to share is called the Socio-Technical Sustainability Roadmap. This is a framework developed by a project at the University of Pittsburgh, supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. It really is a set of modules and questions to help project teams plan how to create and sustain a digital project. It's pretty comprehensive. It's probably a bit overkill for most projects. It consists of 13 modules, and it asks you to, it kind of walks you through different questions. Who the project is designed for, what parts of it are most important to sustain, who is responsible for which piece of technology, how is the funding going to be maintained, and all of these questions will be answered differently for different types of projects. It's mostly focused on kind of public-facing web-based projects, and just to give you some. I just pulled out here a few of the highlights of this, but it does go into a lot of detail about very practical things about file formats and web server space. But some of the main takeaways from this are that it asks you to think of projects, these web-based projects in particular, in 3 different stages. Active creation, so when you're building and creating the project. Ongoing maintenance, when not so much new content or scholarly material is being developed, but the project still want it to be available. And then retirement. Does the project just end and you let it break? Do you have an archiving plan for the project? It asks you to think and plan in 3-year chunks. We all want our projects to live forever, but you can't really, that's really impossible to plan for. So if you can think about 3-year chunks of how the funding and how the staffing and how the functionality is going to survive for that 3 years, and then you can come back and revisit those, that plan. For long-term sustainability, it asks you to, helps you to identify or ask you to identify the most important sustainability priorities. So what is important that without which there would be no project, or the project wouldn't be what it is. It talks a lot about the importance of effective documentation as staff changes, as you put a project aside and come back in a year. That documentation is key, and it's something that often gets overlooked. And it has a lot of practical tips for how to structure your folders, how to write that documentation, and who has access to that. And then it also has you explicitly identify individual and institutional partners and their responsibilities. So I won't go into detail a lot about all of these, but it's a very comprehensive framework for planning and sustaining more larger scale digital projects. All of the, but I want to mention another approach as well, and this is something coming out of the minimal computing movement, and kind of developed by one of our colleagues, Alex Hill, who's a digital humanities librarian at Columbia University. He talks about this digital divide in digital humanities, unequal access to technological infrastructure. That could be electricity, it could be bandwidth, could be access to training, storage space, censorship, language. And he argues that we can't, as scholars, wait until all this infrastructure is in place to do our digital humanities work. There's a lot of digital humanities that is going on, as we've noted, outside institutional structures of universities or grant funding. So these concepts can help in terms of developing projects and thinking about how we can work with computers and technology in the humanities in a place where hardware may be old or internet is unreliable. And Alex connects this to the work of an architect from Cuba, Ernesto Orosa, who talks about this concept called the architecture of necessity. So architecture which can be physical architecture, or in Alex's view, technical architecture that grows according to unpredictable logic, according to needs on the ground. This could be, for example, the difference between a large-scale institutional repository built by libraries or governments, or a one-off quick digital archive built using Omeka or a static website for digital editions. This is really tied into the kind of DIY, the do-it-yourself and hacker culture, but it also needs to take into consideration, I guess, the particular geopolitical conditions of each place. So there's a group called the Minimal Computing Working Group, which is developing tools or discussions around these kind of concepts. So using the term minimal computing to refer to computing done under significant constraints, these kind of significant constraints. So they've been developing some digital platforms as well as recommendations for like building a translation toolkit to help translate digital humanities scholarship from English to other languages, or back and forth. And one of the, so I'll show you a couple of projects. So one, I'm just going to point you to a couple of James's projects here. And James, if I mischaracterize them, please let me know. But one of them is a tool that Alex and others have developed. It's called Jekyll Ed. It's a static website generator for digital editions, and it's developed with the idea that the most important need for humanities scholars across regions is the renewal, the dissemination, and preservation of the scholarly record. So this is a tool that allows, or is intended to help scholars do recovery work by creating easy, legible, digital scholarly editions, rather than requiring full markup in tools and technologies such as XML and the text encoding initiative, and putting online or texts that rely on big institutional structures or complex databases. This is designed to be kind of easy to read and easy to disseminate. So it's a static site generator. There's no there's no database. You build the site on your desktop, and then it's just a set of static HTML pages that can be put on servers anywhere, can be exchanged through flash drives. It's much easier to maintain in the long run because you don't have to maintain a stack of technologies and databases underneath it. So one of the projects that James is working on here at Kansas is the Onitsha Market Literature Archive. This is based on material that we actually have here at Kansas, but it consists of stories, plays, publications published in Nigeria in the 1960s. So we're working on moving those from a database into this online format. Another common activity is just creating digital archives. So here is another project from James, the Digital Nollywood Archive, and this is aimed at creating an open source digital archive of Nigerian movie posters for students of film history. The primary mode of this is collecting film posters by photographing posters that are found in public spaces. And it's an attempt to enable the preservation and exhibition of these posters, to expand the notion of what constitutes the historical record. This is built on Omeka, a tool called Omeka, which is an open source tool for building digital scholarly digital exhibitions. Another one, this is a larger scale project, but it's about building archives. This is another project here at KU. It's called the Black Book Interactive Project. My colleague Mary Emma Graham is creating a corpus of 1,500 novels by African American writers from the 1850s to today, and putting those online into an archive, working with the University of Chicago, that can then allow scholars to do text mining and visualization of this corpus. Most of these novels are not already online, so it's making available a whole new set of material for research. And I think the other interesting thing about this project is not only that it's building an archive of content, but it's also building a community of scholars around this content. So they are awarding stipends and bringing together about 15 to 20 scholars each year to share in digital humanities workshops and to develop research questions and share research ideas around this corpus. So it's an example of a project that's not just a technical content site, but also building a community around it. I want to talk about very briefly 3 other approaches to archiving. We've talked, the last examples have been examples of capturing the past or capturing the print cultural record. There's also a lot of efforts to document the present as it's happening, and 3 different approaches to this I could mention are community archiving, web archiving, and social media archiving. Community archiving, here is this is a project called Documenting Ferguson. It's also built on the Omeka platform that I just mentioned. It is based around a police shooting of an African American man in St. Louis, and was one of the events that led to the prominence of the Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States, and a lot of protest activity in that city. Documenting Ferguson is a community website that attempts to capture and document the events, the protests, and materials around those. It collects user-contributed photographs, governmental email records that were obtained by Freedom of Information requests, and other materials. It's really a community-driven site, so anybody can submit material and create their own metadata around that. And so it bypasses, I guess, traditional institutional archival ways of collecting this material. It puts that ability to contribute material and to determine what is important and what people want to share in the hands of the community. Another technique is web archiving. And this is where a web crawler will go in an automated process and collect web pages about a specific event. And there's a lot of tools to do this, both institutional level tools as well as desktop tools that an individual can use. So the Internet Archive has a service that allows for this. They have a tool called Archive It, where you can specify certain URLs, and they have a collection online. So, for instance, this screenshot is of a collection of websites around the protests in Turkey in 2013. It basically harvests the whole site and gives you an archival, a permanent citable archive of those websites, which are often news sites or individual sites that have been put up and are in danger of disappearing, but they're archived here permanently. So Archive It is a tool that is used for at the institutional level, but there's also tools that individuals can have access to. In the Internet Archive, for instance, there's a page on the Wayback Machine. You can enter any URL that you want to save, and the Internet Archive will archive that page at that instant in time and provide you a permanent citable version of that web page. Then there are also other desktop tools listed here that allow you to run a command on the command line and harvest harvest data onto your own desktop for either archiving or analytical purposes or other reasons. And then the third area of activity that's quite popular now is social media archiving. This is where you collect data such as Twitter hashtags or Instagram posts that document current events or movements or protest movements. I would just point you to one site here called Documenting the Now, DocNow, which provides a lot of resources, tools to do Twitter archiving, to gather Twitter and Instagram data or Facebook data, as well as tools to visualize that data and guidance on different types of ethical considerations related to privacy or technical considerations about preserving. So a great site with a lot of resources. I just want to follow up on a couple things that came up in some of the previous discussion. What I've talked about here so far are mostly web-facing projects, but there are also a number of digital humanities efforts that are non-project based, that enable the kind of storytelling or cultural heritage capturing that we've talked about. So one example here is a colleague in Missouri, our neighboring state, Joseph Erb, has worked with technology companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft for years to integrate the Cherokee language and Cherokee alphabet into those operating systems as a way to enable those communities, those indigenous communities, to be able to share their own story and heritage. That language was not available to anybody, and he would see his youth in his community sharing using, you know, their smartphones and on the internet, but everything was done in English. They had no way to actually share their traditional stories or heritage. So that was a big challenge for him in terms of just getting the language to match what the requirements for Microsoft Office requires certain types of language around just even things as simple as dates, how the computer manages dates, or parental controls, things like this. Revealed this gap or this seam between the Cherokee culture and language and how operating systems work. But now the Cherokee language is included in every major operating system and allows people to communicate in that way. And so it's a way of not only preserving the language, but also the culture. And then we talked about these archival silences where descriptive terms aren't enough to match what the kind of scholarly work we want to do. And I just wanted to mention another effort that is attempting to address this in the LGBTQ area. So there's a couple of projects called, research terms around LGBTQ issues have changed a lot over the years, and they have never been included in library metadata, or at least the terms have changed or are not adequate to capture the range of terms that people are using. For instance, in the Library of Congress, which is used not only at the Library of Congress but all around the world, terms such as lesbian or gay were until the mid-70s included under the category of sexual perversion. And there's really only until recently have there been any terms about, for instance, transgender issues in library cataloging terms. So people searching for those material around those terms prior to their use in library catalogs can't easily find them. People who identify with those terms don't see themselves reflected in the archives. So one of the efforts, I don't have a slide for this, but that I can point to is a controlled vocabulary called the Homosaurus, which takes the concept of linked open data and allows libraries and archives and museums to apply new subject terms to their digitized material and share them with each other, and provide a centralized location to search across material that would otherwise be well, still may be difficult to find, but helps make that kind of material a little more visible, and enabling people to find it, to do research, to share stories. The final concept I think I want to mention is just the need to think about humanities research and collections as data. What is humanities data? So this could be any material created as part of the research process, which may be used again as the input to further research. So this can be primary texts, spreadsheets, metadata. It could be your algorithmic code. It could be the output of that code, the visualizations and related files. It could be collections of images in different data iterations. All of this is research data that we need to think about ways to capture and save. And just point to a couple of further resources that might help in this area. One is this humanities data curation organization, which provides some guidance. I also point to my own library's guide to research data management. This has lots of tips and guidance on how we organize our files, how we apply metadata to our own data that we create, how we name files, where to archive this kind of data, and how to share it, among other things. So this is often, especially in the humanities, not the way that humanities scholars are taught to think about their work, but even but as we've seen people already today talk about archiving or text analysis and corpus analysis. So it's kind of that same concept, but thinking really about how we make these collections available to reproduce research or to make them available for others to do their own research on them. So one trend in libraries is this collections as data movement. For example, rather than, or in addition to, putting up, for instance, digital books, manuscripts, for instance, as page images. We used to have page flipping and try to replicate the look and feel and the functionality of a print book. Many libraries are now putting their collections online as downloadable data sets that then researchers can use and apply their own tools to. So I just want to end with a couple of just links to some resources that may be helpful. These, I won't go through all of these, but these are lists of tools, lists of tutorials to teach yourself specific techniques. Here, one that is particularly easy to read and to learn from is called How Did They Make That? That has 6 or 8 different examples of common types of digital projects, a digital edition, a map, a network visualization, and it sort of deconstructs those and walks you through step by step how to do that with easily available tools. There's a link at the bottom to some of the tools I mentioned. And let me see, the last thing I have is just an encouragement to join this organization. I know that Tunde has been active in this, and James and I are both involved in this, and I'm sure some other people here on the call are as well, called Global Outlook Digital Humanities. The purpose of this organization is to break down barriers that hinder communication among digital humanities scholars. And it is really just a listserv. You join the group by subscribing to the listserv. It is part of it's a special interest group of the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations, which is the main international digital humanities professional body. And its intent is to help connect scholars across the world to where there may not be digital institutional DH centers or that kind of institutional support to the national DH organizations. And they also promote different types of projects. So they're the group that is promoting the Around DH project that Sylvia showed earlier with the map of different digital humanities projects and other kinds of outreach. There's about 600 people currently on that list. I encourage everybody to sign up and to continue these kind of conversations on that listserv as well. So that is my kind of whirlwind presentation and sharing of resources. I would just, I'm not sure how much time we have, but I would just open it up again, kind of echoing Sylvia's question about, interested in hearing what the main challenges for people are in pursuing their digital humanities research. And that can be conceptually, but it could also be access to resources, collaborators, funders, training and knowledge, things like that. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Right. Thank you for this very brilliant initiative and for bringing us all together to have this fruitful conversation. I guess it's been a while. My journey into the digital humanities maybe set up begun around 2012 when I was a research fellow for an institution here in Atlanta. But first and foremost, I have to give kudos and credit to James and the KU crew. Thanks to you guys for what you're doing, and also to everyone who has joined this meeting this afternoon. I give you kudos. I hope you all are holding up fine in light of the global pandemonium. Well, I started my journey, as I said, around the 2012 in the digital humanities space. And 2013, I went independent, curating a project which today is called Comparative Heritage. So if you check out comparativeheritage.org, that's my research. And quite honestly, I just want to share from what I've heard so far today. I am enormously encouraged because I've been going through personal struggles with my research. It's very daunting. My interests are in the area of generally the academic study of religion, but specifically I'm interested in exploring the meaning of scripture. What is scripture? So using the digital humanities idea, that sort of helps to think through, or at least to begin to think about what exactly do we mean by digital humanities. I've heard I think one or two of these prior speakers mention Africa and in relations to the digital humanities project. So it is going to be, I guess, one area that I want to also invite some of you to think critically about what we are trying to do with the ideas that we are proposing. When we speak of develop, when we use some of these languages, these terms, I think they're freighted with problems, which we oftentimes assume to be innocuous, on their own. Although we, on the face of it, are interested in helping to preserve memory, to foster conversation across board, across culture, across fields, disciplines. What I think from my own research has been helpful is knowing the embedded ideology within the formation of any particular discipline. The lady Badu Ama, yes, thank you for talking about poetry, and I think that's quite helped me to recall my research into religion and the invention of the academic study of religion. What exactly that meant, you know, it wasn't academic for the sake of academic. It was a field that was instituted in order to study and otherize other people, you know, to create certain kinds of categories that were considered not to be at par with, you know, the dominant people. Now, again, still using this as trope to discuss what we are doing with the, or what digital humanities is. I guess these sort of questions will help us not fall into the trap of refine the problems that we are trying to dismantle. Right. So digital humanities on its on the surface is a brilliant idea. It's something which we all should be called and encouraged to come into. However, we need to do it consciously. We need to be aware of what we are doing, to the extent that when we say what is digital humanities, it is not just about what we define it to be. It is also, and it includes what we do with it. What are we doing with it? You know, what's the overall agenda? So when we say we rely on Western tools and Western technologies to do, you know, Africanist studies, exactly who are we subjecting and who are we privileging? You know, these sort of categories are helpful. And to piggyback on Lady Badu's idea that some of the sites in Africa, cities, states, were not collatable, you know, by using the tools she had used. It simply meant, again, to tell us that in the African Yoruba idiom, they say, I'm going to say it in Africa anyway, for those of you who don't understand the Yoruba language, get a Yoruba dictionary. They say, so similarly, when we say digital humanities, someone is behind it that makes it digital, if you know what I mean. So I'm going to stop there.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, David. We'll think about that Yoruba expression more more collectively later. But for now, we really need to allow as many people as possible who need to say something. Also, I mean, just answer, if you want to respond to Brian's question or you want to talk about something else. But I think David has given us a lot to think about, to reflect on, and what I'm taking out is perhaps the idea that these platforms and tools and technologies are not neutral. There are people behind them, and these spaces therefore come with the ideologies of these, of coders, the owners of the infrastructure of the internet. So thanks, David. There's something I know people may also want to talk about, why you think about the reflections. We really need to wrap this up in about now, but maybe we could stay to 12:15 if that's fine.
Yes.
Yeah, but I'm thinking people may want to talk about textual analysis. Sylvia, I know you referenced this later, but I would be interested in listening to people's on this.
Okay,
the idea of textual analysis. Yeah, please go ahead.
I work in the area.
Go.
And my current research is actually looking at Voyant 2. And that's currently my PhD research here at the University of Birmingham. Because while I was at home, I was among the people that's in Nigeria. I was among the people who were privileged to attend conferences and workshops in digital humanity organized by Professor Okwebi and some other scholars from Europe. And part of the questions that came to my mind was like, as David said, that this idea of deploying tools to actually resolve questions in humanity, especially in our part of the world, it's not something to jump into, but it's something to actually look at. What is the structure? What is the epistemology? What is the ontological ideas that actually influence the programmers or the developers of the tools? So because apart from just coding, you have to first of all think of certain ideology and brainstorming stage. So I was just a little bit disturbed with the fact that we carry content, we just put content and put it into the tools and then discuss interpretations and meanings, and I was just like, no. And then we just say we have done a project or a particular. So in the course of thinking about that, I look at that it's like most of these tools were actually developed within certain knowledge system and also worldview. And for them to actually capture a whole sort of project, it's not like we are running away from, you know, those tools, but we're going to look at how can we capture ideas or epistemological theories that before the colonial era, you know, the narrative is always like as if we don't have anything, there was no knowledge system before the colonial era, that some of those things will bring those epistemology and it becomes the framework for actually developing tools or joining developers. Now, the research, in quote, is actually what influenced my own personal online project, which I call Paint Me Black. You can see that www.paintmeblack.com. Now, on that website, what I try to do is like, there are narratives of African knowledge and theories. Let's talk about Ron English on African fractals. Let's talk about cloud. Let's talk about, so all these people, they have been talking, they have been writing books, talking about fractals as foundation to algorithms, or talking about even the IFA, you know, with this algorithm. And some people talk about even the way the indigenous alphabets have been structured. So I try to look at those things. And I try to look at these things could actually be explored because they have just been seen as, okay, maybe African arts and sculptures and all those things, but some of them, they have rationality behind them. And that's what actually influenced, because prior to the narrative, most of the books will talk about, okay, they don't have literal, the African was, the previous African society was all about oral tradition, and then they did not write down. We could actually say, yes, that's true, but it's not like we are currently writing, but presently, the world has moved from writing to digital space. And the most important thing is like to capture, first of all, is not to run after the discourse. For me, I just believe is to capture the past. First of all, bring these knowledge systems into the fore. You know, and this will have a lot of things like Ron English will say, that the future, if you want to talk about coming up with framework, coming up with aesthetics, whatever their knowledge to tap also from the African indigenous knowledge system. And if you look at this, I just feel to a great extent, it's not just about helping a group of people, but it helps or it gives an opportunity for contribution to global discourse in digital humanity.
Thank you, Augustine. Really thought-provoking. Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
Yes, I would like to see some things. Hello, James.
Yeah, James, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity and for putting up this kind of initiative. Let me start by saying that my first exposure to digital humanity was from the University of Lagos Summer School. Throughout my undergraduate days, studies further, up to the postgraduate studies, I never came across anything like that. So I would say it was an accident that I came across that summer school because I was not even invited. I just met somebody who was going and who was not, who was supposed to go and who would change his mind that he wouldn't have that opportunity. So I took it, and since that time I've continued to try to develop myself in that field. Now, I think some of the arguments have ensued in this discussion, and I want to say from my little exposure to digital humanity, I think DH will try based on collaboration. In the first place, digital humanity is not a humanity stop on its own. It has to be a combination of computer science and humanity. So the major question should be, how are we using digital humanity to solve problems of that relate to Africa? It is not necessarily, for me, it's not necessarily about who made the tool that I'm using for this to solve this problem. It is not about whether it is Western. Even the computer itself is not an African thing on its own. So I think we should start crawl before we start to walk, before we begin to fly. We have a lot of projects in Africa that different tools that we have come across that other software developers are put together that we can deploy to some of these problems, and then we can really get something good from it. Most importantly, for me, I am more of the linguistic aspect of DH, and then just like Augustine said, for me, I'm not going so much into coding, except in the recent time when I started trying my hands on RStudio and some stuff like that, you know. So I'm thinking that what we need to do should be focus on solving our problems, whichever aspect we are coming from. Whether somebody mentioned being in conflict, peace and conflict studies, of course, DH is very important to that. You can begin to look at the different conflicts, how it emanated, and you begin to do digital mapping for all those things. So, for instance, for me, I embarked on a project recently on colonial letters, and I was surprised to see that some of the thoughts, the relationship the followers and the leaders had existed even in that time, you know, in terms of relationship, in terms of references, in terms of how human beings are valued, and so on and so forth. So DH for me is not just about whether the tool is developed by Africans. It is the collaborative effort to solving problems in the humanities, irrespective of who developed the tool. But if you are interested to develop the tool, then it would be a very big thing. It would be a very big combination on your side that you've been able to contribute something very important to the discussion on the digital humanities. I think I should stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I just had a question. Yeah, before Brian presented, I think Ayodele, not the Ayodele that just the one before, raised an issue about the learning curve involved in acquiring new DH skills. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I just wanted to find out what people's personal experience has been. I remember taking a Python class maybe a year or two ago, and it was advertised as not requiring programming experience, as all these things do. I took the class and realized that was not true. And that's been my experience a number of times. Like, you try to acquire new skills, like join an R class or Python class or these things, and then you find out very soon enough that the learning curve is steeper than has been advertised. So I'm just curious for people like Ama and anyone who's doing any kind of hardcore work with any of these specific programming tools or skills. Like, I'm just wondering what your trajectory was. How did you get around all these statistical tools and all that? So yeah, I'd just like to hear what people's experiences have been.
Anybody who has a project wants to talk about this?
I can say a little bit about it since Elias just mentioned me. So I would, and this is a question maybe perhaps nestled into an answer. I sometimes wonder, for those of us that say that we are digital humanists or we do digital humanist work or we're adjacent to that field, does that require that we be coders, right? Does that require that we take classes? And I think this relates somewhat to what you're saying, Elias. Does that require that we take computer science classes, that we take introduction to Python in order to really take on that term? But for what you were saying, Elias, your exact question, the only way I learned these tools and the only way I could ever get a handle on things like Python, or even basic CSS and HTML to build a website, is I had to have a fellowship for it. And I had to be trained to do that. And I had training, not extensive training, but I had training for about 2-3 months, 5 times a week for 2-3 months on doing digital humanities work. So that's the only way that I was able to do that. I have colleagues in my department that, although they're in the English department, my department is interesting in the sense that grad students don't have to take classes in the English department. Our committee members don't even have to be in the English department. They can be anywhere, really. So there's one person in my department who took the majority of their classes in the computer science department just so that they could be well-versed in computer tools, computer languages, in order to do Victorian studies, because it's an English department, right? So they do Victorian studies, but all their classes, or 70 to 80% of their classes, were in the computer science department. So for me, I've had to just, like I said, just do training in it. And I feel like the training is never over because I'm still not well-versed in these languages. I understand the tools that I'm using, but I only understand them to a certain extent. So I don't understand the sort of backlog, like, how do I put this? I don't understand how they are constructed, but I know how to use them, right? And I think that to do really impactful DH work, at least the type that I would like to do at some point, I need to understand how to build those tools rather than to just use them. I think there's a difference between using them and building them. Yeah.
For me, I just feel that I got something about learning, unlearning, and relearning has been the future of education. While I was at home, I've been reading all the digital humanities scholars, Europeans, and I found that they are humanists too. They are like philosophers like Rockwell, Sinclair, Franco Moretti. These are ordinary, and it's not just to call a programmer, collaboration is necessary, but you have to still learn. And I started with HTML, CSS, and from there, it became exciting. And WordPress made it easier. So coming up with WordPress, having a GoDaddy account or any other hosting account, setting up something, it was so exciting to come up with something in the first place. And that was the beginning for me as a person. And I started trying to engage myself more in developing something with those skills. So within the departments and other people, when I hear anybody want to develop a website, whether you pay or you don't pay, I would just do something and host something. And that was what informed my current research. Like now, I will not deny the fact that where you are also in the world can also add to the skill, because I know that being in this part of the world with my student ID, I've been able to enter a lot of places and see a lot of resources. And also the institution also provide what we call it, some kind of instructor in Python and in our programming. Because if you just engage in the two and you're not involved, you're not inside it, you will feel as if you, even if the programmer is developing it for you. But what I would say is that looking at debate in digital humanities and discourse around what we call it, the Professor McCarthy's link server, I found that there was a time also in the history of developed nations where they have to organize a lot of seminars and programmers and call a lot of humanists to learn most of all these things. And I feel that no one can say computer is not Africa. It's not computing, nobody can, and we can't shy away from that. If we shy away from that, from the learning, unlearning, and relearning, we are going to still, so many years to come, it will be said that we didn't write, or we did not come to the digital space. That's just my own conclusion. Just get around.
Yeah, thanks, Augustine. We'll have time for just one more comment. I think we really need to wrap things up. But I don't know if Brian or Sylvia would love to speak to two questions that came up in the chat bar. Okay, so Maria, you're asking how to overcome the fear of learning technical skills and those kind of stuff. Do you want to speak more to that?
No, not really. It's just I have a lot of interest in the digital humanities, but I'm in no way a programmer and I don't have those skills. And I feel like, just as I said, I have some block even in approaching that. So if anyone has advice about that, that would be great.
Yeah, so Brian is on mute.
Mariah, I think the fear is a positive thing, particularly because your attitude is like you're willing to learn. And I think that's one of the main things when working with digital humanities is that you're not limited into what you will be learning. So, but I think it's like step by step. It doesn't have to necessarily start with the coding. Like you can, like digital humanities projects has different things. So you can start with other things, and then once you are more familiar with the procedure, you can start with the coding. And yeah, I think the coding is essential, particularly with the maintenance of your project, as well as if you want to go in a more advanced research, particularly with literary studies or scraping data. But it can be once you are in the project rather than the first step.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. So I think we need to wrap up now, but I don't know if the folks at Lagos would like to add something. Professor Kwebe, I know your workshop takes collaboration with the computer science department. Is this something you want to continue to do in the future? And if you could just speak to that to wrap up, to conclude, and then we'll be done.
Thank you very much, James. It's been quite very exciting, and thank you all for your contribution and the presentation. It's been quite educative. I'm sure that collaboration starts this way. So from this, I'm believing that the conversation will continue offline. And then I want to encourage that let's keep the conversation going. With respect to what we are doing in Lagos, yes, we are doing some collaboration. At the moment, I have some software experts working with me at the center, because we have a project we are working on. And we are also trying to develop an application specifically for that project. So it's very important that while some of us may have the time and the energy to learn coding and to begin to go deeper into this, we can actually get help from experts, and then we can share with them our ideas, and then we work together and we learn, and then we develop tools that are specifically related to the project we are actually working on. And with that, we can go places, we can do a lot with that. And it's very important. Somebody mentioned the need for us to do personal development. Of course, you need to invest in yourself. Some of us, we were able to do what we are doing today because we decided we are going to invest in ourselves. And that accepts us a lot. Thank you very much, James. Thank you, Brian and Silva. Thank you, everybody, for all your contribution. I've learned quite a lot from you, Brian. I think we'll keep on the conversation. I've learned quite a lot from the tools you have shared with us. Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you.
Yeah, so before people go, just a couple of announcements. One, thank you again for joining us. We know these are not the best of times, right? But so thanks for doing this with us. And then I need to say that we will likely have a Twitter conference for Africanists in the fall. So please be on the lookout for that. And then just to say, we may need to call you guys again to do this probably sometime down the line, just to keep the conversation going. I'll be collecting some of your projects, have them on some platform online to make them more visible and to link things together so your work can be out there. You can find people to collaborate with. If you have questions, reach out to Brian, reach out to me, and be on the lookout. We'll be reaching out to you too, so that the conversation can continue. So thank you, everybody, and